Thank you. All right, so I think everyone can see my screen and hear me, and I really have enjoyed the conversation so far. I've enjoyed the really broad range of perspectives. So I'm going to summarize some work I did. Like I said, I'm a scientist, but I actually went, in this case, to the Library of Congress and looked through some of Carl Sagan's files, specifically on UFOs. I was curious to see what he had. So this is kind of, an interdisciplinary presentation where I'm a scientist, but I'm kind of doing, some work that's more methods in the humanities. And, I think what kind of comes out of this, a few different lessons, but one of them I think is very useful to our conversation about the role of humanities and the sciences in this conversation, this evolving community, and as we start this new journal. So to begin talking about stigmas, the preliminary assessment report on UAP in 2021 said sociocultural stigmas and central limitations also remain obstacles to collecting data in UAP. And so they go on to say that there's aviators and others who describe disparagement associated with observing UAP, challenges to reporting it or discussing it, and they note that reputational risk may keep many observers silent, complicating scientific pursuit of the study. And the fact that this was actually written in the OD&I report was significant in helping to reduce the stigma. And indeed, in the recent 2022 OD&I report, there are 366 new UAP cases. Some of these were explained already, some of them weren't, many of them weren't. But there's 366 new to the 144 that reported in 2021. And they noted that the increase is partly due to reduced stigma. We're all here having this meeting. I'm not worried about losing my job. The culture has shifted, so this is encouraging. And so simply, the ability to conduct experiments like we've been hearing about earlier today, to increase reporting in the intelligence and defense communities, tackling this idea of stigma is really important. I also want to mention, just from this report, I think it's important, it's still an unresolved question as to whether or not there are concentrated areas in which UAP are observed, or whether this is a collection bias. There's many selection biases in astronomy. We saw the biggest hot Jupiters first before small Earth-sized planets. Doesn't mean there's more of them, they're just easier to see. And so, there's a possibility that we're seeing, biases in certain areas where there's more sensors. And so, UAPX and Galileo project and some of these others we've heard about will help to solve that aspect of the problem. And so destigmatization is one of the themes of this presentation. We heard a little bit about Carl Sagan yesterday, which was really exciting to hear. So Carl Sagan was a famous astronomer and popularizer of science. He took what I call skeptical interest in UFOs as a scientist, and his position may have changed over his life on that. He received many letters from his fans that sort of conflated paranormal concepts with objects in the sky, or assumed the extraterrestrial hypothesis by default. And we've seen a range of talks at this meeting that talk about the umbrella of concepts that have been considered under the topic, the term UFO. Whereas some of the talks we've heard today are more narrowly focused on anomalous objects in the sky that can be measured by instruments. And there's clearly interest in kind of convolving a lot of this by many of the letters he received from the fans. There were some conversations he had with scientists and engineers who focus on UFOs as a physical problem, but not very many. He did support further study of unexplained cases from Project Blue Book, regardless of whether they were extraterrestrial, just that the percentage of unexplained cases in Blue Book was unacceptable from a scientific standpoint, and more work should be done. And so the difficulty that I think, what I took away from Sagan's notes, and then also others I meet in the astronomy community, there's sort of a difficulty in sifting through sort of, what I call the noise of popular opinion when you're looking to find, what might actually be anomalous. And so we'll unpack this a little bit here. The Library of Congress, thanks to Seth MacFarlane, creator of Family Guy, hosts some archives from Carl Sagan, and so this opened in 2013. I noticed here, if you look in the contents, box 790 will start with two-stream approximations, but then you've got only unidentified flying objects, and there's 4 boxes that have contents in here. Now you can see the first box, it says 1952. There's a very little bit of information from 1952, but mostly Carl Sagan's notes start in 1968. I believe when he was at or just about to go to Cornell. The anecdotal evidence we heard yesterday, which was, sort of reporting on someone's perception on what Carl Sagan said, came earlier than that. And so I don't have any, this collection does not have any evidence from before 1968. But I thought, well, let's go take a look. So I went to the Library of Congress. And so my questions: what did Carl Sagan consider worthy of archiving in his UFO files? Did he ever discuss UFOs with James McDonald? I was very interested in that question because James McDonald, hopefully most people here know about James McDonald. We'll talk about him a little bit later, but prominent atmospheric scientist who took the study of UFOs very seriously. I was curious who else he talked about UFOs with, and was there any data? I don't think it'll surprise you, there wasn't much data there, but I was curious to see, what all he had maybe collected. The first thing I saw, I opened up the file, the very first thing was a copy of the Majestic 12 documents. This is from the FBI website, where they've been sure to mark it very carefully, but Sagan's copy was authentic, unmarked. You can look up the history on the Majestic 12 documents for yourself, but I included here to show Sagan seemed to be just in information gathering mode. I don't know that he necessarily believed that this document was accurate, but at the time it came out, it was unclear. And I think just in terms of like, well, here's a thing, let's look at it and file it. It's important to have at least that sense of an open mind, open in the sense that you don't have to reject information, even if you maybe are skeptical of the content of that information. There's other sources of what I call noise, again, in his collection. There was articles about crop circles. Now, during most of his life, crop circles were an unexplained phenomenon. Again, you can go look this up if you're unfamiliar with crop circles. Some of these are quite amazing on how they're constructed. These days I haven't heard any talks, for example, at this conference specifically about crop circles having been, something that's resolved. Now, I have in the note there was also articles about, alien abduction, out-of-body experiences. These are topics that maybe have historically been stigmatized also. I personally do not believe anything that we want to study in good faith should be stigmatized. But those topics may be distinct from what commercial and fighter pilots are observing and seeing on radar. I'm not saying there must be no connection, but there may be separate topics. And so if they are completely separate, then that can be a difficulty in getting the astronomical community to take seriously the search for aerial and astronomical anomalies if it has nothing to do with some of these more personal, psychological or psychedelic experiences. Perhaps these are separate phenomenon. So we talk about that a little bit maybe in the discussion. So the majority of what's in this collection is notes from his fans, photographs, accounts of UFOs, really nothing that we would consider useful as data, even in the way that Wes described in his talk. There's not much useful. It's very anecdotal. And then you see, what do you do with these? You attach them and file them in the general UFO file. And so it was also kind of fun to just see the handwritten notes between Sagan and his staff on how things worked. In his public statements, Sagan seemed to focus on natural objects, light sources. He liked to talk about how many UFOs were probably just a military project that couldn't be declassified yet. He had got a lot of letters with people who were not scientists, but they were kind of upset at his dismissal at this, as somebody who was interested in understanding, what we call now astrobiology, the study of life in the universe. He was very interested in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and what we call technosignatures today. Many people thought that he was doing a disservice by ignoring the UFO topic. These kind of letters, there's conspiracy theories, there's retirees, average working scientists, but there weren't really any active researchers that were writing these kinds of letters. So I'll show just one example. This is kind of a characteristic example. I'll read it out loud. I won't do a lot of this. But I think this kind of gives a good flavor of the kind of letter we get. So, dear Carl, I've been in the process of writing this letter for many years. And since I'm getting older and may not have too many years left, I've decided to stop procrastinating and get on with it. I decided to write to you because I've admired your work for a long time and feel that you are one of the few top scientists in this country who has the perception and vision to address this matter in the proper way. Your Cosmos book and TV series confirmed this idea in my mind, and I must speak now or keep my mouth forever shut. Carl, the UFO phenomenon is real. This planet is being surveyed by several high technology civilizations from outside our solar system, and this program has been going on for a long time. I must explain that, technically, I have no recognized scientific credentials. I'm not a PhD. All I have is over 30 years of detailed study and research and enough firsthand experience to fill several books. During 27 years of active military service, I was involved in incidents and studies and read highly classified reports that will never see the light of day, regardless of the Freedom of Information Act, that fully confirms the reality of our visitations. I've collected and analyzed data that's overwhelming in its implications, and I'm sick of the cover-up. In your thoughtful and beautiful Cosmos, you included a chapter that deeply moved me. Who speaks for Earth? Carl, we speak for Earth. We speak for Earth, you and I and others who care about it. But we must not only speak for Earth, we must speak to Earth. Here we go. People must be, sorry, there's little pop-ups happening in front of my window. People must be told some truth. I feel that if they knew what is happening, it could expand their consciousness and awareness as human beings and children of Earth. I understand that you know Alan Hayek and Jacques Vallée. Listen to them, Carl. The invisible college exists. There are thousands of them who have data similar to mine and know. Talk to Amy Michael in France and Charles Bowen in England. They know. Gordon Cooper knows also and has had the courage to speak out. My concept is that if the people of Earth knew and understood, it would help create a human sense of brotherhood. It would help us grow into an expanded awareness of our place in the universe. I dream that someday, somehow, an audiovisual presentation similar to your Cosmos would show the people of this planet that we can have an unlimited future of peace and cosmic growth and understanding. We've wasted so much time. Someone like you or Steven Spielberg could do this job. The telling of truth must begin. As the walrus said in Alice, the time has come to speak of many things. Someone who's respected and has some credentials should begin. Speak out, Carl, examine the evidence, and tap your vision. Use your creative dream again as you did in Cosmos and help us grow, help us tell some truth. So, I think this captures a lot of ideas that we talked about, especially yesterday. And this is the kind of plea, I think this is one of the more eloquent ones, and somebody who has had some personal experience in the military, coming to Carl Sagan with, again, obviously with the extraterrestrial hypothesis in mind, and concerned that people like Carl Sagan and others who are supposed to be interested in these topics are not. There were a number of letters from Stanton Friedman, who was, is a proponent of UFO studies. Stanton Friedman was a heavy critic of Sagan's position. Some of these critiques are a little outdated now, but many of them are still quite interesting to look at. There's several articles by Friedman that were archived in the collection. Friedman seems to take these MJ-12 documents seriously, and I think that sort of undermined the type of conversation he was able to have with Sagan. So I will not read this whole letter, but just as an example of one of the letters that came from Stanton Friedman, you can see at the beginning, dear Carl, it really saddens me as a classmate of yours for 3 years to write you again to correct a false and misleading statement that you made. So here he's very concerned, and then he's written again here, copying his previous letter. Dear Carl, I'm still waiting for an answer to the above letter, but I need to clarify, some more, points for you here. And here Carl Sagan tells his staff, no, I'm not going to reply to Stanton Friedman, just file it. And they weren't sure if Friedman deserved his own file, if it went under UFOs. So I could not find evidence if Stanton Friedman and Sagan actually met and talked. But I did find a list, a question, a document here that was titled "Some Discussion Topics for Carl Sagan Preliminary." So if they did talk and you know about it, I would love to hear. but I could only go based on what was in the archives. But these discussion topics were quite interesting. I won't read all of them, but I'll kind of summarize here, and you can take a look. What Friedman, again, is strongly preferring the extraterrestrial hypothesis, assuming that there is a connection and that SETI scientists should be interested. So why is it that SETI specialists make proclamations about interstellar travel when that's really not even their expertise? And so this is one of the ideas, that it's interstellar travel that led to what we're seeing as UFOs. The middle one, why is it that SETI specialists take every opportunity to attack the notion of UFOs without actually referring to the evidence? I think this is a valid point still today. I don't think that every astronomer should start studying UFOs, but I think there's, especially with these ODNI reports and then the reports from around the world that have been discussed at this meeting, to casually dismiss the evidence is I think not being a responsible scientist or scholar at this point. You can say you're not personally interested in the problem. That's fine, I guess. But the dismissal at this stage, I think, is very difficult to be sort of intellectually honest, in my opinion. And so, this other one I think is quite interesting. Why is it that SETI specialists seem to assume that aliens want to deal with them? They don't speak for the planet. The military has $1 trillion budget. I talked about at the beginning that there may not be a selection bias. Maybe there is, and maybe they see how we allocate our money and decided that the military is who they should talk to. So I'm not saying that's my opinion, but it's certainly interesting that that Stanton Friedman wanted to raise that point with Carl Sagan. So a couple other interesting discussions, because there was very little from professors and other researchers, and the Stanton Friedman letters were probably the closest. But there was a Xerox here of a letter to Tipler. Tipler was a physicist who wrote this article, "Extraterrestrial Intelligent Beings Do Not Exist." And so this is one of the articulations of the Fermi paradox. And it's saying, well, if extraterrestrial technology is widespread, there was plenty of time to spread through the whole galaxy, and we look around our own solar system, we don't see anything, so where are they? That means they're not there and we're alone. That's the Fermi paradox, or the Fermi-Tipler-Hart paradox. There's a few authors that have published on it. Fermi never even published on it, but Tipler was one of the people. And so, I'm sure many people in this meeting are already thinking like, well, wait, but what if they are here? And of course, you don't even have to invoke UFOs. It was just plain old solar system SETI, like is the other part of the Galileo project. There could be, Oumuamua could have been a passing, spacecraft. And I don't think that particular one was, but that's totally a viable hypothesis for other objects. There could be artifacts on the moon that are evidence of extraterrestrial beings having passed through before. So this letter that Carl Sagan archived here is essentially raising this point, saying, Dr. Tipler, I enjoyed your article, but he says, underlined, your arguments demand that we seriously look about us for signs of the presence of a highly advanced civilization. And I think he's right. And I think, we do see this idea of solar system SETI being taken more seriously now than it was, even just 20 years ago, the idea of looking in our solar system for extraterrestrial artifacts on the moon, free floating Lagrange points, things like that. But then this person writing this letter is connecting this to UFO work. He said he's never published anything on this. He's felt that this is obvious. He claimed to be a member of Alan Hynek's Invisible College, and just says, this is something that we need to do. He says, you agree they could be here, and if there's intelligence out there, they should be here. So then you have to look. So now he's not writing to Tipler, but you can see the letter was carbon copied to Carl Sagan, and also Frank Drake and Philip Klass and Alan Hynek and some others. But this is at least, one of the very few, if not only, examples of a letter that actually was from someone who's an active physics professor at a major research university, who says, subscribe to the ARPO bulletin. And so at this time, 1980, this is still something that's attention, and maintaining your secrecy and your involvement as a scholar is important for your reputation. So finally, I was interested in did Carl Sagan meet with James McDonald? Did they have any conversations? James McDonald is perhaps the most notable scientist who's investigated UFOs. He was a member of the National Academies of Sciences, atmospheric scientist. They did seem to both agree that you needed to study the Project Blue Book cases more, that 30% unexplained is not good enough to say there's nothing to see here. There's at least one opportunity that they had private conversation. They were both on this hearing that the House convened in 1968. And that was the last time that there was a congressional hearing on UFOs or UAP until just a year and a half ago. So there's these papers have sort of a lengthy statement by James McDonald and by Carl Sagan. There's the printed copy of the congressional statement by McDonald that had a pencil note in the top, so it seems like they had at least talked and exchanged papers that way. Data from Project Blue Book, but no real original analysis. Sagan was apparently involved, though, in corresponding with Blue Book officials. There was a lot of carbon copies of letters that he sent, and so he was at least active in urging Project Blue Book officials to take this seriously, do their due diligence, and not just sort of perform the actions just to satisfy the call. But so yeah, you can find all of that conversation. So Sagan writes in a letter to Brian O'Brien, I've spent a few hours with James McDonald of the University of Arizona. I think what is important is not so much McDonald's tendency to accept the statements of a few witnesses of Undermine reliability. I'm not sure how reliability is to be determined, but that in investigating the supposed identifications made by the Air Force, he has uncovered a large number of extremely serious errors, all in the direction of classifying as known objects, which are in fact unknown. I think it is quite important that future investigations sponsored by the Air Force should scrupulously avoid such misclassifications. So without needing to take a position on the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which McDonald strongly favored, where Sagan still acknowledges that, if James McDonald can analyze Project Blue Book cases and find that some of these have been misclassified as known when there's more to learn, then the Air Force is not doing their job correctly. And whatever these things are, even if they're not extraterrestrial, it's a science question, and one should do this correctly. So in his congressional testimony, Sagan says, to conclude, what I understand is the main reason why this congressional committee asked to testify, which is about extraterrestrial visitation, it's not beyond any question of doubt that we can be visited. There are great difficulties from our present point of view, but they are not insuperable. And if Dr. McDonald, for example, were to present me with an extremely convincing evidence of an advanced technology in a UFO, I could not say to him that it's impossible because I know you can't get from here to there, or I can't say to him it's impossible because I know there aren't any guys up there. On the other hand, I would of course demand very firm evidence before I would say that seems to be a likely hypothesis. So this is the attitude of the scientist. And I think I definitely have heard this attitude in some of the talks today. The design of the Galileo project, for example, the project can be motivated by the search for extraterrestrial technology, but you can still have sort of an agnostic design that requires this high bar of evidence to see what you're going to find. And so whatever it is, this attitude of the scientist, I think, is what we need to have, and what one message I try to convey when I talk to my colleagues in astronomy. And he goes on other points from the congressional testimony, that he should emphasize there are very intense predisposing emotional factors in the subject, again alluding to the broad history that we heard about yesterday and the personal experiences that are invoked by some experiences that people have. This is, again, the domain of humanities. It's clear that the scientific method says you simply keep an open mind and pursue whatever facts are at hand with as many diverse hypotheses as possible. You try to eliminate each one and see if you're lucky with any of them. So this is what science should do when we're approaching this problem. He says if Congress is interested in pursuing the question of extraterrestrial life, I'd be better off supporting, astrobiology program, Mariner, Voyager, radio astronomy rather than UFOs. But on the other hand, he says a moderate support of UFOs might have some scientific value, even if it's not connected to the search for extraterrestrial life. And I personally agree with this position. I think I'm agnostic as to whether there's a connection or not. Either way, I don't believe that any scientific study that's done in good faith should be stigmatized. And I think that this is indeed something that's unknown. I think more scientists should be excited about the fact that there's something that we don't understand. That's what you do as a scientist. There was some correspondence with Philip Klass, UFO skeptic. It seems that they actually got along well, became cordial and friends. There was archived copies of the Skeptics' new UFO newsletter. In a letter to Condon, Carl Sagan writes, thanks for the other side on the recent skirmish, although the Bryan Times is not going to get very far with me by drawing a parallel between the Warren Commission report and your study, his study being obviously one skeptical of UFOs. I think there are various very grievous and methodological issues in the Warren Commission report, but I know that your report on an even more controversial subject will admit a sufficient number of alternative hypotheses, so it's not similarly vulnerable. So, I think the Condon report is kind of historically looked at as one of the factors that kept UFOs stigmatized for so long afterwards. And so, Sagan's kind of expressing an opinion where he at least is encouraging, Condon to admit enough alternatives so that you're not liable to the type of criticism that you have your blinders on. So there's lots of newspaper clippings that were just, cultural interest in the UFO phenomenon, just showing general curiosity, Journal of UFO Studies. Here's one example, showing Carter taking interest in the problem. This one, a bit misleading headline, the UN discusses UFOs and then sees close encounters of the first kind, did not necessarily see UFOs after discussing them. There was no correspondence or data from pilots. I was interested to see if there was any pilots, but of course there's a lot more data that pilots can collect nowadays, and there's more ease of communication. I was not able to, or I didn't have time to search Sagan's digital files, however, from 1985 to 1997. So everything I had was when we were working on typewriters and carbon copies. So around 1985, we've got 3.5-inch floppy disks. So it's possible. I may go back at some point and look through those, or someone else could. It's open to anyone. Were there emails that he received from pilots or something? I don't think this will necessarily give data that will solve the problem, but it could be interesting to look at. In his book, that was a AAAS symposium that he was one of the sponsors of, Sagan notes 4 challenges to the scientific investigation of UFOs or UAP. The first is the religious aspects involved in this. For some people, it's not a scientific question of studying anomalies in the sky. It has a lot to do with personal experience, or maybe the idea that there's aliens that are bringing salvation or some other awakening to the true reality of the universe. And so it's not so important to that group to resolve, what we called, was mentioned yesterday, the ontological nature of UAP. Whereas for the Galileo project and UAPX as examples, that is exactly what they're attempting to do. There's boredom and novelty. A lot of people may be attracted to the UFO or UAP topic simply because it's interesting and exciting, and there's a kind of some emotions to follow. And I mean, I've even noticed that there's been some public pushback against or skeptical of NASA and DoD taking interest in this, because that sort of removes some of the novelty from it. Related to that is the third point, the idea of classification. When something is classified, a lot of people just get interested in that. You may be a conspiracy theorist, you may not be a full-on conspiracy theorist, but you may just start to wonder, like, well, why are they classifying that? yet. And some things get classified for very mundane reasons, or reasons that we accept because we don't want to give our adversaries information about our defense technology. But whenever something is classified, it's ripe for speculation. And that kind of speculation, especially on a topic like this that has a rich cultural heritage, that speculation can grow and has a lot of narratives it can grab onto. And then the fourth one that I think is very important, and this one is perhaps the most relevant to other scientists, is an intolerance for ambiguity. We don't know what these things are. We heard today about some experiments that are being developed to look for them. We saw some preliminary data, and it'll probably be a couple years before we've got a really robust set of data to analyze and say something really meaningful. Well, that's a long time to wait. We want answers now. 2 years but I mean, 2 years is short for a scientific experiment, and even in 2 years, we're not going to necessarily have the answer. So leaning into the ambiguity of the situation should be part of what we do in a scientific problem. And I think some people, both scientists and non-scientists, want to quickly explain it away because we can't just embrace the ambiguity. And so this is what Sagan says. This is precisely where we ought to be on the UFO problem. Say there's not enough data, good judgment isn't possible yet, and that an open mind should be kept. Scientists are particularly bound to keep open minds. This is the lifeblood of science. So one of the things he writes, one of the interesting psychological phenomenon uncovered in the course of arranging the AAAS Symposium on UFOs in '69 was the strong opposition of several older physical scientists. These men were convinced that AAAS sponsorship would somehow lend credence to unscientific ideas, despite the plans for discussion of all sides of the question, as described in the introduction into the traditional manner of science. So I probably don't have to dwell too much on this, but again, stigmatization, and this meeting we're having now goes a long way toward undoing that. So that's just a couple of things. I'm almost done here, but Philippe sent me a couple of very interesting tidbits that were not in the collection, but these are quite interesting to show. 63, this is before the archive at the Library of Congress started. This report notes that Carl Sagan gave a talk where he stated that Earth may have been visited many times by galactic civilizations and may have, maybe you should look on the hidden side of the moon for artifacts. Someone asked him if he believed in flying saucers. He said, I do believe there are objects that are unidentified, but he did not indicate whether he considered their source. And this is I think this is where a lot of SETI or technosignature scientists and astronomers may be at today, where this idea of looking for life on exoplanets is now part of the mainstream. There's a big NASA mission being planned that prioritizing that goal. Looking for techno-signatures in exoplanetary systems, seems to be gaining more acceptance among mainstream astronomers. The idea of looking for artifacts in the solar system, on the moon, on Mars, there are papers published on this, and so this is maybe was less mainstream 20 years ago, but it is becoming part of the dialogue of mainstream SETI today. So what about this connection that the UFO phenomenon might be connected with that? That seems to be a point where a lot of astronomers have trouble making the connection. So I won't read this, but this was quite interesting too, that Carl Sagan received a letter from Jacques Vallée, and then, which I don't have, but he wrote back to Jacques Vallée, and Jacques had encouraged him to read his book. And in general, Sagan is a bit skeptical of, he says he'd been very impressed with the fallibility of observers reporting unusual sightings, the tendency to exaggerate, amplify, and extend, to make a routine or dull life a little more interesting. This speaks to the part of what, specifically the social sciences has a role in this, in terms of how do you understand eyewitness testimony? And as an astronomer, I think, Carl Sagan had no idea how to evaluate such things. And of course, others who are not trained in those methods can also misinterpret eyewitness testimony. And so science. Sagan mentions, he's tried to follow flying saucer literature, but it's difficult. He hasn't been able to look at all of them. But then he says he encloses these papers of general interest, one on extraterrestrial life, another one just kind of standard, representing more so the standard astronomical view of like, well, here's how we're approaching the idea of extraterrestrial life, and here's what we think we know about extraterrestrial objects. And he clarifies his view on the lunar base, that like, well, that might be a nice stopover if you're visiting the solar system, but he doesn't see any connection to UFOs in that case. And I think this response is maybe a little bit more accepting the idea that there's maybe something to learn, but then also maybe somewhat of an example of the way that mainstream astronomy may feel about some of this. So in my last slide, the bulk, just to summarize, the bulk of the content was related to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and there wasn't like just pilots saying they saw something weird. What is it? Today, I hear about pilots who are just concerned about flight safety risks. It's not whether it's extraterrestrial or not. Sagan advocated for a hypothesis neutral approach. Many of his fans criticized this approach. They said, like, well, no, you have to take a harder stance. You have to prioritize this extraterrestrial hypothesis if you're going to be doing this SETI technosignature work. On the other hand, he faced criticism by other astronomers for having such wide-ranging interests, which included not just the fact that he dared to talk about UFOs at all, but also even just his general interest in SETI and technosignatures. That itself was an area for criticism. There's evidence there may have been some professional jealousy over having been on a TV show, but it can be a little bit of a lose-lose situation, at least at that time in history. If you take one side, you're kind of getting the academics riled up. If you go too far on the other side, then you're too skeptical and not having an open mind enough. So, the final point, and maybe this is something we could discuss, there's a lot of topics under the ufology umbrella, as Greg talked about yesterday. If we are interested in studying this narrower set of objects that are in the atmosphere, or maybe, in the lower layers of space, at the upper atmosphere, the way that UAPX and Galileo Project and some of these others are doing, if we want to understand those, some of these other topics under the ufology umbrella actually complicate attempts by scientists who are interested in this serious study. A lot of astronomers may find this to be a more interesting problem if they knew that they didn't have to also entertain, some, other mystical ideas that, may seem kind of like woo to them, when really what they want to focus on is using instrumentation to examine objects in the sky and look for anomalies. Now, I'm not going to say there must be no connection between anything mystical and what the objects in the sky are, but I'm going to say there is an experiment that can be done to characterize the objects on the sky using instrumentation. And if we can do that and get good data, then we can at least see where to go from there. And I think framing it in that way is a good way to get other scientists on board. And so that's a lesson I saw in Carl Sagan's collection. And I'm encouraged that the stigmatization has decreased, but it's not gone. And so we should continue talking about it. And this is a great reason to have this meeting and have a journal where we can continue having these conversations. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Haqq-Misra. I know we're running over time, but since I have about 50 minutes so at the end of today, which I don't really plan to say much there, we have extra time. So Silvano, just allow us an affordance to go a little bit over time so that we can have a nice discussion right now. My associate editor, Michael Silverstein, would like to play the role of discuss it. We had a sudden cancellation by the person who was originally assigned. So I'll turn it over to my colleague, Michael Silverstein, for a reaction. Okay, I'm having some weirdness with my display here.
Well, the important thing is,
Oh,
yeah,
there we
okay,
go.
there we are.
Okay.
Maybe you can see us, but we couldn't see ourselves. So I am the associate editor. I have no idea what that means because we have yet to publish an issue. I'm a philosopher of science. I'm not an expert in UAPs because no philosopher of science is yet an expert in UAPs, or has been allowed to, or could get a job for that, or etc. for all the obvious reasons. So I only speak for myself here, not Earth or aliens or beings of any other sort. But I think, by the way, great talk, Jacob, and the other two talks as well, Wes and Matt were great. And I think I'm just echoing, maybe in a more pointed way, that what you were saying in terms of sort of foundations of what we're doing here. And so here's how I see it. So there was this hurdle, and it's still we're not fully over it. But the hurdle is, is there a phenomenon here worthy of study, at least in some scientific sense? I think we're mostly over that, though people are still clearly not complete. And then the other hurdle is, well, what is the phenomena and how should we study it? And here is where I want to say, there's a lot going on here, and I'm sure there's many different aspects and many different explanations and all kinds of weirdness that deserve all kinds of different methodologies and approaches. But if we are just going to focus on the weird stuff, the gray data pertaining to what people have seen in the skies and the videos of fighter pilots and what many pilots over the decades have seen that they've observed, and radar data and other instrumental data, if we just focus on that subset of the phenomenon, I hope we should be past the point of hand-wringing about what the most likely hypothesis is, right? That in other words, even if you grant me just the most priors, right? And you want these feedback, and they want these things to be explained in some, to at least in part explain it in some scientific fashion. It seems like I don't know, for me, the extraterrestrial hypothesis is we're being visited by beings not of this earth, leaving aside where not of this earth is, in craft of some sort. It presents as craft-like, right? So now you may say, but wait, are they time travelers? Do they come from the mind of God? By the way, Berkeley was an atomist. Do they come from other spatial dimensions? No clue, right? But here's what I do know. By the time they get to the void of space and Earth, they're craft-like. And it seems like there's some intelligent. Are there beings in there? No clue. Why are they here? No clue. How do they do it? Do they violate the laws of physics as we understand it? No clue. But I want to know the answers to all those things, right? So what I'm saying is, whatever else you believe, and nothing I'm saying contradicts that, right? Whatever your grander hypothesis is, whatever else is going on, however much this may overturn our paradigms about everything, we should all, as a community, whatever else we do, gather around these people who are seriously trying to get money, influence, and everything else they can get to collect data and analyze the data. We should all agree this is a super important thing to do. And no other hypothesis, again, I don't think I need to do a disquotation on Bayesianism to make this point. No other hypothesis, right? This is common sense, is more obvious, this is more likely than the idea that these are some intelligent something and they're moving around in craft somehow, right? Even if you think, they're super psi power and they're beaming it all into your mind, well, maybe, but that's not the place to start, right? There are physical signals and physical images, whatever you want the word physical to mean. So I just hope whatever else we can do, I hope the next time I go to a meeting like this, nobody has to spend any time hand-wringing over, this is the place to start for at least the phenomena that relates to craft moving around. Thank you.
No, that was very well put. I totally agree. And I guess the only thing I'll very briefly add is that is what we can observe. If you try to let's say it's an intelligent being that knows it's being observed and it doesn't want to be observed. Well, that's a result then that we'll get from these projects, and then you go from there. If there is something bizarrely weird, you just have to be patient, go at the speed of science. That's what science does, and so yeah, that's exactly right.
We might fail, and we might be, stupid space monkeys that can't work it out, but we have to try, right?
We have to try. The experiment's never been done. Even the classified data the government has is not a systematic attempt to observe this. So you have to do that experiment, see what you get, and go from there.
Wes, I think you have your. Oh, sorry. I muted you by accident.
That's okay. Jacob, thank you so much. This is very interesting work. And it's very important to understand the stigma and how it operates, and looking at it through the lens in particular of Carl Sagan and how he interacted with other scholars, I think is a great way. I just wanted to add a couple of things, and probably things you're already aware of, but maybe everybody else is not aware of. J. Allen Hynek repeatedly complained about Carl Sagan not knowing much at all about UFOs. Not having investigated the cases, read about them. So even, despite what he said, I have tried to follow the saucer literature. Maybe that wasn't so, or maybe he did that at some point. I don't know when J. Allen Hynek said that, but clearly they had interactions, and J. Allen Hynek found it extremely frustrating, and it seemed to him that Carl Sagan was ignoring a lot of evidence. And the second thing I want to note is that, or wasn't engaging with it deeply. Okay, that's what I want to say. The second thing is that he, as I'm sure you know, and as many people know, there was a book published posthumously, A Demon Haunted World, which is a kind of manifesto on critical thinking. And at the end of that book, or somewhere in that book, he distills down 4 outstanding mysteries that, that are really, really strange things that maybe require some investigation. And I believe UFOs was not in the list. So at the end of his life, he didn't feel it was necessary to put that in the list, interestingly, although he did include reincarnation. So that's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Those are both great points. Thank you, and good to see you, Wes. From what I understand is toward the end of his life, his position was that the most unusual UFO cases were probably a military aircraft that just hadn't been declassified yet. And just from, I think that was even in Demon Haunted World or some other one of his books. And yeah, I did get the sense that I did get the sense that Sagan and many other scientists had not actually taken a serious study of many of the UAP cases. I think that's still a problem. I think having more publications in journals will help with that. The fact that a lot of this is in a gray literature has made it difficult. And then again, the stigma is part of it.
I don't see any hands up, but yeah, go ahead.
I just, relating to what was just said and what I said before, this is the sort of thing that just drives me nuts. The hypothesis that it's, super technology that governments are hiding is just absurd, right? I think it's more likely they're ghosts. I mean, what you would have to believe it's super duper high tech, if you take the data seriously, and we saw slides today about the crazy dynamics in kinematics, right? And if you believe that there is multiple sources of data that confirm those dynamics in kinematics, then you already know this is not earthly. It's ridiculous we even have to talk about it.
Yeah. And to focus on that kind of data, and especially as we get more data, that will be convincing to astronomers and physicists, and hopefully get more interest in the problem from those communities.
And I just want to jump in here, though. I mean, I sort of alluded to this at my opening address. Isn't it really, Jacob, the case that it's not necessarily a question of more data, is it, right? I mean, or is it just a question of more data that more people have their hand in and which can be independently verified? Because we've got plenty of cases which are fairly convincing already. I mean, right? I mean,
I don't think you can learn much from historical cases other than what Wes talked about. You can use historical cases to design your experiment. But I suspect that even the data that's classified, it's not the kind of data that would be scientifically useful. What you need to do is what Wes described in the UAPX, you have a distributed network of a multi-medium sensor apparatus that's collecting data over a long period of time, so that you need to get actually a statistical sense of these things, sort of the way we do exoplanet science. You don't just want to find one planet, you need to get a sense of how common these things are. So no, I don't think that we have enough data at all. I think all we can learn from the anecdotes and historical data is how to design your experiment. But it has to be done systematically and with intention. There's actually been no intentional attempts at collecting this data.
I completely agree with you that we don't have enough data and that we should be spending lots of resources and time and human capital to get more data. I mean, it's just, that's a no-brainer. But we have the data we have, and some people, right? Well, I mean, we'll hear this tomorrow. Some people have, to the best of their ability with the data we have, started doing calculations, etc. We can look at it and we can decide if we think the calculations are good or the assumptions are reasonable or not. But if they are, if you trust the fighter pilot data and you trust, what seem like reliable witnesses and you trust these calculations, I think there's already enough to say that, something, I don't know, again, does it violate classical or quantum? I have no idea. But something very strange is going on that we have no idea what it is.
No, absolutely. There's enough data that exists to say there is something that needs to be studied and explained. But how do we explain it and study it? We need more data for that.
So I understand we're way over time, but Silvano, can you allow a single more question? One more question from the audience. Okay, great. Dr. Gabriel Della Torre, I think you had your hand up. So why don't you take it? And that will be the last question, and we'll transition to Dr. Colombano.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think that this was a very interesting presentation, but I think that focusing on data is not the answer. I think that focusing on data is very good under a psychological point of view for the scientists. Those scientists that feel that scared of going into the topic. So they feel more comfortable when they are dealing with data. But I think that the phenomena has data and more stuff. And maybe data is an anthropomorphic way of approaching the topic. Is the one we have? Yes, but we have to think that social sciences are also science. It's not only physics and chemistry. So I think that we have to be careful when we are talking about like analyzing crafts, because if you see a light, maybe it's not a craft. So what is a craft? That's something that we have to be careful. And also in regard of Sagan, I see that he got to some conclusions without studying the phenomena, but he gave some conclusions. And I think that he didn't criticize the Blue Book, and we all know that it was flawed in the scientific way. So I think that we have to be careful taking the topic too much into our way of dealing with things here. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
No, thank you. I appreciate those comments, and I fully am sympathetic to the idea that there could be aspects of this phenomenon that are unexplainable by physical astronomical measurements. I guess all I would say, just to add on to the comment I made, is we should do the experiments the way that they're designed, look at the data. The data may tell us that this type of experiment is the wrong type of experiment, and there's something else going on, and we need to move on to other methods. And I think that would be something very useful to learn still. So either way, I think that's just one of the first steps, regardless of what it ends up being. But thank you. I appreciate the comments.
I agree with that.
All right, so I think we should thank you very much, Dr. Haqq-Misra.